In this module, I want to look at how you can work with databases in MVC, ADO.NET, and Entity Framework, and just basically how you can work with databases from an MVC application. Now, in a previous class, we would have connected to the database by just using a index controller or action method in a controller and just connecting to it directly, going through and making a connection, making a command, executing that command, and then sending the results over to the view. And it does work. This works just fine. From there I can go ahead and display the results of the view. But it's not considered a best practice. It's a good place to start, but not the best way to go. The reason why I start with the simpler one is because, well, obviously it's simpler, and the other one is pretty complex. Let me take a look at that. We're going to create this more complex example in this video. Well, I've already created the example, but I'm going to talk about it. Of course, we want to have the standard pattern of 3 tiers. We have the application, we have the processing, we have the data layer. So our web application is our UI or front end. It also contains some processing code. So I'm going to call it the web application server code. Then you have a separate processing code. Then you have the database table. Now that's a very standard, just database. That's a very standard way of working with things. I think maybe I should take it just called database. The additional layers we're going to have with MVC is we're going to have an MVC view. We're going to have an MVC controller, and the view works with the controller works with the view. We're also going to have the controller work with an MVC model. This is referred to as a domain model. And that model would have classes and interfaces to actually hold the data from our database in memory on the web server. So you grab a copy of the data from the initial source, the database. You bring that copy over in the form of usually like a list object of some type. You hold it in memory, and then you interact with that copy. So that's a very standard pattern of working with web apps. To move the data around, we use processing code. And if we want to change the data, if we want to update the data, insert new data, or delete data, we do so through the processing code, which then talks to stored procedures, and that may talk to either the table directly or indirectly through a view. Now this is a very formal process with lots of layers, but again it's complex, but it's not that difficult, and it is considered a best practice to have these additional layers. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to use the Microsoft's Northwind database, and I'm adding in some additional code for stored procedures for insert, update, delete, and then a view to go along with it. If you don't have the Northwind database, you'll need to get that. I did include it in the modules folder, and I'll show you where that's at in just a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up a Visual Studio solution that should be available with this video. And excuse me. And then I'm going to create a product's domain model. I wouldn't really call it a product's domain model. I think it's a bad name. This is actually, the domain model usually applies to the actual model inside the MVC application. So create products abstraction layers. Much better name. I'll change that over in my script file here. Copy that so I don't have to mess up the typing. We're going to review the SQL code, and we're going to go ahead and review the processing code, and then the domain model code, and the default controller code, and finally some views. So that's the game plan. Let's get to it. So again, if I don't have Northwind, I can go ahead and start here in my MVC solution, and I'll just run this code. I've modified it a little bit from Microsoft's original, to kick everybody out if they're on it by putting it in single user mode. And then there was a couple other stored procedures that were pretty old that no longer work in a modern database. So this actually creates a brand new copy of Northwind. Now I'm going to add on some items, and you can see here this is a place where I'm going to rename it. There we go. I'm going to add on some abstraction layers. Abstraction layers. Abstraction layers probably different. So from here I'm going to go ahead and focus on Northwind. You can see I've got plenty of data in here. Right now there's a bunch of different columns. The only columns that I really need, I don't know if you can see this, let me focus in on. I don't need anything that allows nulls. The only thing I really need to work with the products table is the product ID and the product name. There's also another column at the very bottom that doesn't allow null. That's discontinued. However, it does have a default. So if we don't specify otherwise, it'll actually go ahead and put the default. And what this means is that I don't really need to, for this demonstration, work with all the columns. I can just use the essentials. And those essentials are the product ID and the product name. So to work with that, only exposing some of the information from the products table, which is one of the advantages of having a view. I'll go ahead and create a view. And this gives me only what I need for the application I'm working with. It doesn't modify the database, it just makes a saved select statement. It doesn't also copy the data from the table and make it a new structure in the database. There's no actual additional data storage taken up. It truly is just a save select statement. So that's one layer of abstraction we're adding. The next layer of abstraction we're adding is some stored procedures. I have a stored procedure for creating a new row of data. This is my insert stored procedure. All I need is the product name because the product ID is automatically generated for me. I'll just insert the product name using this parameter, and I'll have a new value. I'm also going to make a stored procedure to select data. In this stored procedure, if you give me a product ID, I'll use the where clause to search for that product ID. However, if you don't give me a product ID, it'll use the default value of -1, and if that -1 is still there, it'll give me every row. It's because if this is still -1, then -1 is equal to -1, and the way a select statement works is the where clause examines each and every row. If the answer is true, you get the row back. Well, when this answer is true every single time, you get every single row. And I'm going to go ahead and create a update stored procedure. You give me an ID, you can change the other column values. In this case, the only other column is the product name. And finally, a delete, in which case I go through and give me a product ID, I'll delete that product for you. I want to make all these stored procedures and the view. Yep, I already made the view. And now we want to make sure it works, so I'm going to test the code. The view is working. I'll try the insert. If you do an insert and it automatically gives you a number, you can use the add@identity system variable to capture that number, and I'm going to go ahead and use that on my select stored procedure. So this will give me the new number that was inserted, and I'll be able to select only that data. So the new value was 78. If I do it again, it'll be 79, 70, 80, 81, 82, and so on. Update is going to be very similar. We're going to capture the ID, and then I'm going to change the product name from, let's see, I didn't change the very name very much today. Product 1, or A1. Let's see if that works. Awesome. Notice that this time I didn't do a select statement on the using the stored procedure and a particular item. I just went ahead and used my view. So because of that, I see everything. And I'll do the same thing here. This will delete the value. And again, I can test to make sure that the select stored procedure works without the parameter by running it like this. And you can see that it used the default parameter value, and so gives me everything. And with that, I have the abstraction layers all set up to go for the database. So I've got these items right here. Next on the list is we're going to take a look at the processing code. I have the processing code over here in my web application, and here's what it looks like. This is representing another layer. I said the 6th layer. I guess this would be, we've seen 2 other ones already, so this would be the 3rd, but the other ones, yeah, I think I changed the numbers here. The other ones will be showing up here in just a bit. So in here, I want to be able to connect the database, and I made a method that just goes through and configures a connection object and returns it. Now, in reality, I would actually read the connection string out of a web config file. That would be the more appropriate way to do it, but I didn't in this case, just I'm just trying to get the demo up and working, and it's a demo. But again, in real life, that's what I would want to do. Oops, let's go over here. Now, if somebody wants to create a new row of data, I'm going to use this method called process create. And that's going to get my little connection object ready to go, create a SQL command object, and then go through and configure the command object to use my connection, open the connection, and issue this command. Execute the name of the stored procedure by the parameter, with the parameter and some value coming in from this parameter. Now, this is not the best way to do it. Oh, it works. It works just fine. The problem with it is somebody could inject some nasty little SQL code that could do things that you wouldn't want it to. They could do it by just changing this over to a semicolon to indicate that you've ended the statement, another one to indicate you've started another statement, and then whatever bad code they want it right in here. And now it would think it was 3 commands. This one, and then this one, and then the bad code in between. So that's a real bad idea to do it. Again, it does work, but that's not the best practice. I'm going to show you the better practice in just a bit. But I did want to show you that this does work. As we'll see, it's just considered a bad idea. Now, if somebody wants to, that's if they want to add a new row. If they want to read the data, in other words, select the data, I'm going to go through and use the stored procedure called select product essentials. I'll go ahead and create the command object, the connection object, and everything else. But this time I'm going to go ahead and use the proper way of doing it. I'm going to use a SQL parameter object. I'll tell the name of the product ID, just kind of like what I was doing up here. That's the name of the parameter. In this case, the data type is an integer. If you were using a string of characters, you'd want to go ahead and use the SQL database type of variable character, and in most cases it's going to be a Unicode variable character, which in SQL is represented with an N. So that would it would be dependent on what this data type was here. If this data type is a nvarchar, then you need to have the nvarchar over here as well. We've got a match. And SQL Server uses different database types than .NET, so that's why we're using the SQL database type. Now with that, you do use your parameter coming in and we set that to the value, and then add it to the collection of parameters that are part of the command object. Open the connection. I'm going to execute the command. This time I'm getting back multiple results, several rows of data, or at least one row of data. If they provide me a -1 value, I'll give them all rows. If they give me an actual product ID to process, I'll give them just that row. But either way, I'm going to go ahead and use the execute reader option. This is a factory method. It'll give me a data reader that I can work with, and I'm also going to make a list to hold my data as I process it. I'll process the list by using the while loop, reading through it, and picking up the data, and every time I loop through each row of data, I'll deposit it in my generic list of product essential objects. A product essential object is an object that is going to, that's probably why I had those numbers off. I guess I need to look at this first. I have, yeah, that does make sense. This would be the third layer actually would be an interface. I take this out just to make the demo a little bit easier to read, but in best practice would be to include it. The fourth layer would indeed be the abstraction layer of the classes that represent our domain model or data model. And a product essential represents one row of data, where product essentials with an S represents a collection of rows, in other words, a table of data. You insert, update, and delete against the table, and so I put the methods down here: create product, let's see here, read product, update product, and delete product. These are all methods that are part of my domain model. And what they do is they call the methods in the processing model. That's why I'm trying to review this first, but perhaps it should have been left as the 6th level. Lots and lots of abstraction layers. So let's see here. When it finishes up, when you call this, it'll finish up and return a list of product essential objects, which again hold rows of data. It represents one row of data. Product essential, no S. Update is similar. Make the connection. Actually, I guess I got lazy and didn't put my parameters in there. Bad teacher. I didn't do it on the delete either. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Yeah, I probably should go back and fix that. That's not something I'll do in the video, but I'll probably have it fixed by the time you watch this video. It'll be the same code as I used on this insert statement up here, or read statement. I'm going to go through and make the parameters. And in fact, why be lazy? I'm going to go ahead and just do it right now. Oops, got a little bit more to do. It might help somebody. This code is going to be replaced. Copying that code. And coming down here where the bad code is. And we're changing this to, this is the update one, so it's going to be UPD. I'll try to keep my naming conventions pretty easy. For that one we need a product ID, and we've made a product ID parameter, but we also need a product name, so I'm going to have to make another parameter for this to work. And it'll be the product name parameter. SQL product name, that's what it's called in the database too. Its data type though is that in varchar. And in this case, it's got a size. The size is unfortunately 80, which is kind of an odd size, but it works. It's going to be dependent on, oops, let me go back to my SQL code. It's going to be dependent on this right there. It's got to match. Okay, and then I add the product name and that to the collection. Product name is my parameter coming in. Now I have two parameters in the collection, and the command text, because it's set to be a stored procedure, is expecting only the name of the stored procedure. All this other stuff will be taken care of for me, because I set this to a stored procedure and I've defined some parameters. And since there's only really one more to do, I'll just take care of it right now. Now this one we already have, we just need the product ID, so it's just the name of the stored procedure. And again, everything else is going to be taken care of. There we go. So really, it's, if people say that, you know, the reason why they programmed something like this is just because it was easier. Well, yeah, it was a little easier, but not that much. As you can see, it was pretty easy to convert over. I'm going to leave this bad one here just so that I can tell people about the injection attack one more time if I use this demo, when I use this demo next. Let me build it, make sure I haven't blown anything up here. Yahoo! It works. So that's the processing layer. Now we've got the view, the controller, and the model. Close this down, and we'll go look at the model next. So in the model, again, I would recommend that you have interfaces. That's considered a best practice. For this example, I went ahead and commented them out. But in real life, that's what I would recommend. We would have these classes, Product Essential representing one row of data, and Product Essentials representing the table of data, implement those interfaces. In the one that models the row of data, I have two properties, one for the product ID and one for the product name, and a little constructor that, if they want to, they can go ahead and initialize the product ID and name when they create the object. The product essentials represents the entire table. I've got a list to hold the table of data locally on my web server. I should say table of data, I should say the results from a query of that table, because it really doesn't hold the entire table. It just holds what's necessary. This is one of the differences between the way the entity framework works and natively anyway, and the way that you can make things a little bit lighter weight in your code by only restricting what you want. If you go to the entity framework and you start the wizard, they have little checkboxes next to the table, and most people start off by just making a checkbox on the table, and what you end up with is all the rows, no matter whether you need them or not. And they'll make a copy of that data in memory. So in this case, I don't want a copy of everything. I just want a copy of the data that's represented by a product essential object. This code works with the processing layer. It does not work with the database directly. The model is a layer in between. So processing code is here, the model is here, but it talks to the processing code. These two interact. And then the controller talks to the model, and the view talks to the controller. So this part here is the constructor. It'll just initialize my nice little generic list for holding a set of rows. This part here is the create method, which just calls the processor method It seems like couldn't we just put the code in here? Yes, but we're trying to keep a separate processing layer from the actual data model itself, which is considered best practice, especially if that processing layer was outside of the application. If it was going to be used by other applications, it could be in the form of a DLL or a web service of some type, or just a Windows service for that matter. And then you'd call the methods on the web service, the Windows service, or in the DLL, the class library. In all those cases, that code, that separate code, could be reused for other applications as well. That wouldn't be the case if you had put that code in the domain model. It would only be applicable for this one application. It could be argued that since I put the processing layer in the application code, it's really kind of only set up for one application as well, but it could be reused by just copying that file into another project, regardless of the user interface. Still, for whatever the reason, it's considered a best practice. It's not necessarily going to make or break the application per se, but I like to consider it a cheap form of insurance. It ensures that if changes happen or I want to reuse the code, I have a much easier time or more effective time or lower cost time of making those changes. And as such, we don't have the code and this data model working directly with the database. Microsoft's Entity Framework does something very similar. It has something called, instead of a generic list, it has something called a data set or a data table. And the data set holds these little table objects, and the table objects have things like primary keys and foreign keys and check constraints, and they track changes over time, like what was the row previously. If you make a change, like you delete a row, you can find out what the row that was deleted and versus the one that was just inserted if you do an update. It's got a lot of features that the generic list doesn't have. But of course, that means it takes up more memory and it's just a more complex object. Still, I gotta say, it's pretty nice. The Entity Framework uses that as a data model. The data set is the data domain model in the Entity Framework, and then it has additional processing code that works from there. So the create product just calls the process create, and the read calls process read, and the update calls process update, and delete calls process delete. Very, very simple code. And yes, it's an additional layer that does seem like it's not strictly necessary, but it still is considered a best practice to use. Now, the domain model interacts with the MVC controller. Here's my MVC controller. In the index, I want to get all the data. So I'm going to call the product essential. I'm going to make a new product essentials object. I'm going to go ahead and make it an object so that I can have a copy that's unique to my connection. The processor I made static. It's not really holding data, it's processing data. So I really only need one in memory. But the objects can hold unique copies of the data for my particular web session. And as such, I'm going to make a instance-based class. And so I have to make a new one. I make a new product essentials with an S. That's a table of data. I call read product. It will return me a list of product objects. Now, because I'm using a list of product objects, it's not strongly typed to a product essential class, although, to be fair, the generic list is strongly typed. When I send it back, I'm sending it back in Microsoft's View Data Collection, and that can hold pretty much anything. So this is loosely typed as well. I'll have to be make sure I verify that I'm actually returning the correct type of data. When I return the view, to pull the data out of it, let me just right click and say go to view. I'll do so by just using code like this. Let's go through and make a brand new Product Essentials object, and I'll take that data that we got from the view data, convert it over to a generic list. I had to do that because it came in as just a plain old object, part of the view data collection. But once I have it as a collection of generic collection of data, I can make a loop and pull the data out. And that's what I'm doing. I'm just going through, and for each item that you find in that generic list of product essential data, I'm going to go ahead and pull out the product name and the product ID. And also put a little pipe symbol just to make it look pretty. So if I right click and view this in browser, you can see that I have the name of the value, a little pipe symbol, and then these hyperlinks. The hyperlinks are generated by my action link. The action link is the caption that you want on the link. The the action method that you want to use in the controller we're currently in. And then any data you want to pass over. Very important that whatever you list these items as, this is the name of the parameter, and this is the argument that's going into the parameter. This name has to match what's in the controller. To kind of prove that, I've changed this over to deleting product ID, although product ID would be better. If you use Microsoft's template to come over here, right click and say add. Oop, lost off the screen here. Right click and say add a new controller. Still lost off the screen. Okay, well, just have to kind of imagine at this point. You right click and choose add new controller at the top, you'll get this. And I can go through and excuse me, create some read write actions, and it will type out code for me, which is kind of cool. And most people like to have some free code, especially if it works. The problem is, though, is that you got to be careful of this. This will say, if it says ID here, then it's got to say ID here as well. It's got to match. And it's case sensitive. It's got to match that too. That's a very common mistake. People get so frustrated, and I don't blame them. I've gotten frustrated before as well. This is off by name, and so what happens is it just skips over it. It doesn't even always give you an error message. Now, I really didn't need that, but that is a quick way to have it type out the bulk of your code. You just have to go through and change it to make it match your needs. So that's how I get the first listing. The next one is a detail option, and I got that by just copying Microsoft's code. They called it details. I didn't feel like changing the name. I just left it. To get the views, all I had to do was just right click, go through and say add view. I want to display, let's say maybe a list of product objects, product essential objects. I can say add. It will type out the code for me. Isn't that nice? Notice that the edit and details and delete, they have the option for you to add in these arguments, but we don't have anything like that right now. So it gives you some of the code, but not all the code. You still have to go through and doctor it. Still, it does provide you with a nice starting chunk of code, like here on the details. And let's see, if I right click and I say, oops, excuse me, get it on the screen for you. Go to the add view and make a details view that would detail product essential objects. It will give me that feature. Now if I try to start this, I won't have an ID. So if I can't right click and say view in browser, I won't have an ID to start off with. So that's an issue. Anyway, that's how I kind of block this out. But here's the actual code that actually works. So for the details, I get the product ID, and I call my little read product and pass in the product ID. In this case, I'm going to get a product essentials object. This was the S. I need that because that's where my read product method is. It will kick off the data reader, and the first row of data will first column of data will be column 0. I'm just going to return that. I'm so sorry, excuse me. The first row of data will be one row that represents my individual product object, so I'm going to return that. This is strongly typed. So what I'm returning is not the product ID, I'm actually returning a product essential object. If I go over to the view, you can see that here at the top it says product essential is the model. Up here at the top, it doesn't have that model. This is on the end, just the plain old index page. That's because I chose not to use it in this case. I just went through and put my own block of razor code in here. There's advantages and disadvantages to both, but at this level it's not really important. We're just trying to get the how MVC works with the database. So much learned on this. The video would have to be 14, 20, 30 hours long to really cover so many nuances. But the fact is that in my controller here, I chose, just to show the difference, that I could pass over a strongly typed object. Another thing I'm showing here that I didn't do in all the other methods, just to keep things simple, excuse me, is a try-catch block. Try-catch block is, if something goes wrong, I'll go ahead and redirect them back to the index page. I won't get that nasty error, something like that we saw earlier, if the index page is running. And this could happen if somebody tries to directly go to the details page. So the way I have it set up now is if they try to go directly to that page, I'll go to the view, I'll right click and say browse, it will redirect them back to the index page. If however I go through and click on details here, it runs just fine because it passed over the ID. So that's what this code's for. And I couldn't actually even reach this code if I didn't make this nullable. It would give me an error message. Like that. Something similar to what we saw a little earlier. So I'm making it nullable. However, in my product ID and my read product is not nullable, so I have to convert it over to a non-nullable integer. Well, that's the details, and hopefully that gave you some insight on some of those additional features. The crate starts off with a view, and as you can see, it doesn't really return anything. It just actually launches a view. I made the view here. It's based on the product essential model. Because I have that model there, which is, you know, the class that's inside my MVC app, I can go through and use code like this. And I just had Microsoft type out the majority of this code. when I run that view, the product name comes up. Microsoft's creation template would have offered to give me a ID option too. Let me show you what I mean. I'll go over here to default 1 controller. I'll come down here for the create method. I'll right click and say add a view. If I choose this to be a create template, I choose my product essential. It represents 1 row of data because I'm only adding 1 row. When it comes over here, you'll notice that it tried to give me a product ID, which is great, except that the product ID is not something you can insert directly. You have to let it generate one for you. So I just need to remove that. That's all I did. When they press the go button, in other words, when I'm over here and let's see, view in browser, and I put in something, and I hit the create button, it looks like it goes right back to index, but actually it goes to a different version of this create here, the one with parameters. I'm going to stop the application. Oh, actually, I guess I don't have it running here, so I can debug it. I'll first of all go to the index page, and I'll right click on the back, oops, excuse me, then I'll click on this and start it up from here. By starting it from here, the debugging will work now, and I can actually step through the code. The first thing is, of course, going through and reading the product without any parameters, which just creates a new list object for me, and uses -1, and as such, when it goes through and calls my little processing code, this is over in the processor, still -1, and that means it's going to get all the code based on what's in the stored procedure. All the rows get in that code. And I can just walk through this step by step if I'm not sure how it works. Okay, so that's that. The page comes up. Oops, almost. Still got this code to go through, I guess. Now my page should be up there. Did I lose it? No, it's still stuck here. Okay, it just hasn't. Interesting. Not sure where I lost my button. I'm just going to go ahead and continue. Details would go through the same process. Create would go through the same process. We've seen both of those. Let's look at update. So I'm going to go ahead and update. And update, quite simple. I've got a product ID that tells you which one you're going to update. This is going to launch a view. This is my little edit view. I've made some modification to this one as well. I'll show you when we get there. So I'll step into the code, go over and make a brand new row of product essential objects and send that over to the view for processing. Now the row doesn't have any data in it, but it is just it tells me what fields are available, properties are available, and what properties are available, or excuse me, the data type of those. So I guess it would be the properties of those variables. Fields. So it goes through here, makes a list, gets the data. In this case, it only gets 1 row of data, so it only goes through there 1 time. And that comes out to false the second time and jumps out and closes. And you've got 1 row of data in the list. The list then gets returned, and that's going to be passed to my view. up here. Now, I'll go through here, run some code that Microsoft gave me. The one I changed was, it tries to give me the product ID, but this time instead of deleting it, I want to show you a different way. I changed the edit for option. This is an HTML helper that makes a text box for me. I changed it so that it had the read only option on it. This way it'll still show up. It'll just be read only. And in this case, I kind of like that a little bit better. It's got a lot of stuff to go through, doesn't it? Because now you can see the product ID. You can't edit it, but you can see what it's going to be. Hitting this is going to pass the data for the product ID over. Also, there is another way to get the data besides just using the strongly typable variables. You can actually go through and use the forms collection option. When I go over here and look at Microsoft's little default option, you can see they're using that as well. So you don't have to use it, but if you want to use it, you'd use it like this. Each text box, you'd be able to collect the data. I'm going to update the product by taking out the data from the collection. It comes in as a string, so I need to parse it as an integer because that's what this demands. But the other one comes in as a string, and that's fine by my update product method. I'll go ahead and call the update product method with that data. I'll come over and fire up the code, connect to the database, create my parameters. Open the connection, execute the update statement. Uh-oh, what did I do wrong? Oh, I gotta convert value string to integer. So when I copied and pasted, I must have forgot something here. Aha! Right there. Problem with copying and pasting. Okay, let's try that again. I have to go all the way back to the index in order for me to do it, though, if I want the breakpoints. Okay, let's pause there, so we have to kind of step through. Let's see, what is your problem here, Henry? I think I launched the wrong one. We stop everything. Okay. Let's close everything down here. And I don't want the default controller. I want this index page. I may have been on the wrong one. And okay, there we go. Much better. Yeah, I think I had the default one index instead of the standard default one I was using. Okay, so now you've seen this code already. I'm just going to go ahead and step out. And we're looking at the update. Here it is. We're going to hit update. It's going to go through the system, read the product, come back over here, make our little text boxes. Same thing, I'm going to change this over to ZZZZZ and hit save. Okay, this is where it failed last time. Let's see how it does. So, make our connection, and if I get this right this time, when I execute the stored procedure, it works. Yay! I've got our data. And come back and display it. Actually, in this case, I don't display it. I just send them back to the original list page. And delete's going to work the same way. So go through and hit delete. It's going to pass the data over. It's going to take me to a page to kind of let the user have confirmation, let them confirm that they really want to delete this. So I'm setting it over a brand new product object, a strongly typed object. And it just displays the one that they're trying to delete. Notice I'm using a, not edit for, but I'm using a display for. I could have done that with my text box on the earlier screen, like the update screen, but I just want to show you something different. And give them a chance to back out. So do you really want to delete this? If you hit delete, then it goes over to, instead of this first one, which is the get, it goes to the HTTP post one and passes in the ID for the deleting product. Notice that I changed the name here. This is deleting product, so it's got a match from like all the other ones I had, and that's just to prove how it works. I could have used the form collection. You'll see Microsoft's code has both. You don't need both. You can use one or the other. And that's it. When this runs, it'll just go ahead and run that delete method, and you've got that value is gone. So complex, no doubt about it. Lots of layers. We ran a script to create the abstraction layers in the database. We looked at the SQL code. We looked at the processor code. We looked at the domain model. We looked at the controller, and then all the views that go along with it. Lots of stuff to look at in this video. The code, of course, will be in the module. And modules should be with this document. If they get separated, here's some example code just to kind of help out. The next thing that I'd be wanting to do is kind of contrast this with Microsoft's Entity Framework, which is doing the same thing. It's just that they hide a lot of those layers for you. And they have some nice visual features that you just don't get by using this method, which is kind of comforting. It's also well tested. Somebody's already tested the Entity Framework many times, so that's kind of nice. You don't have to do all your own testing with the code that we just did. It's more lightweight. It doesn't have as many features, and as such, it's going to be faster to run. But it has to be tested by you. Either way is handy, and either way is necessarily bad, but the Entity Framework is most often used alongside of MVC. So that's the next thing to look at. But that would be a complete different video, and so this is where this video is going to end. Hopefully you've found this look at how to create your own MVC application using standard ADO.NET code and multiple abstraction layers a handy video. Take care.